Considering the temperature in this room, I think it probably would be a good idea to get started, even if it's a few minutes early. And the room is packed. It's so great to see this room filled with people. This is the third lecture in the series on the subject of the architectural facade. The remaining three lecturers will be taking place after spring break. So following tonight's lecture, there will be Alexander Zeropolo. Then there will be followed by a husband and wife architectural office known as Ensemble from Madrid. And then we will finish the series with a lecture by Daniel Libeskind. So I would encourage you to keep your eyes posted for announcements about those lectures after spring break. Well, it is a distinct pleasure of mine tonight to be able to introduce our lecturer. Ken Frampton is a longtime friend and was, in fact, my first employer. When I finished my undergraduate studies in New York, very fortuitously, Ken had received a commission to do a housing project in Brooklyn, which today is known as the Marcus Garvey Village. It was a groundbreaking project. I think it was a test project for the viability of low-rise, high-density housing, and it went on to, I think, receive quite a bit of accolade. It was exhibited, in fact, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York back around 1973, 74, I believe. So very fortuitously, I secured this position as a kind of draftsman model builder for Ken Frampton, and the experience of working with him that summer was, I can tell you, a formative one. Kenneth Frampton was born in the United Kingdom and trained as an architect at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. After practicing for a number of years in the United Kingdom and in Israel, he served as the editor to the British magazine Architectural Design. Between 1972 and 1973, he was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Kenneth Frampton is currently the Ware Professor of Architecture at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where he has taught since 1972. In addition to Columbia, Professor Frampton has taught at a number of leading institutions, including the Royal College of Art in London, the ETH in Zurich, the Berlage Institute in Amsterdam, the EPFL in Lausanne, and the Accademia di Architettura in Medrisio and Princeton University. In the 1970s, he was instrumental in the development of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York and a co-founding editor of its magazine, Oppositions. His essay, Towards a Critical Regionalism of 1983, was seminal in defining architectural thought throughout the 1980s. Over the years, he has been a leading voice in the history of modernist architecture. Professor Frampton has lectured around the world. He is the author of numerous articles and a number of well-known books, including Modern Architecture in the Critical Present, Modern Architecture, A Critical History, for which he is currently working on a 5th edition, and Studies in Tectonic Culture, each of which represent cornerstones of his work. In 2005, he received the President's Medal from the Architectural League in New York. In 2012, he was the recipient of the Schelling Architecture Theory Prize, and in 2014, he was awarded the Millennium Lifetime Achievement Award at the Lisbon Triennale. It is my great, great pleasure to welcome Professor Kenneth Frampton.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a lot of people, small space, relatively. Yes. Well, this thematic facade, I've never ever spoken on this topic before, and of course, Randall Corman is the figure that hinted that I might try it for once. And so here I am, the first time. And beginning with a facade, but it's, well, a face in any case. That's Gottfried Semper. You know, at the time, it's like sort of 1855, when he was the director of the ETH in Zurich, having been in London, along with Richard Redgrave and the Crystal Palace, and previously, of course, to that in Frankfurt and in Dresden. And but before I get fully into the stuff, I think I should say that I found it necessary to write this entire thing out, and you'll be happy to hear I'm not going to read it. But in any case, I sort of tried to plot my way through this task of speaking about the facade, and it led me to, because I sort of very preoccupied with Semper. You know, the book Studies in Tectonic Culture takes a lot from Semper. But one of the interesting things is that early in his career, he was recommended as an architect to the court in Dresden. I think he was recommended by Carl Friedrich Schinkel. And there he meets one whose name was Gustav Klemm. And Klemm was a librarian in this provincial German court, Dresden, in the Royal Court Librarian. As he was Royal Court architect, and as Richard Wagner was the Kapellmeister to the same court, in fact. And these images are of tattooed faces, of course, from the South Pacific, I think, and they appear in a book, an early kind of anthropological book written by Gustav Klemm. I think it's called The History of Mankind. And so, you know, here we have a face, of course, that is decorated. It's made into a facade in a way. And for Semper, this question of architecture, for that matter, and also clothing was extremely important to him. And also the decoration, the adornment of the body. For Semper, you know, the first, for him, you know, the primordial architectural work is the dress, in fact, the clothing of the human animal, so to speak, and you know, in German that is, I think the word is Gewand, and it's related to the German word for weaving, for winden. The German word, I think, is winden, and so there is this connection between the dress, of course, adornment, and this is also, I think, from Klemm, you know, an Assyrian warrior who was also, you know, it's hard to imagine him fighting in this gear, but anyway, he is also very, very dressed up, you know, and of course one thinks, and I could have included, but I think of it now, you know, I'm always amazed by Japanese armor, you know, how it is, on the one hand, of course, also involving a mask, rather terrifying, but also extremely ritualistic, ornate, woven. Also, it's woven, of course, as was chainmail for that matter. And this is not exactly a mask, but of course, on the topic of war, it is it's covering a face and echoes, you know, the face, the mask and the face. That is the title I gave to this talk, I think, and somewhere Semper says, you know, it's you know, there should be a kind of authentic relationship between the face and the mask. The mask is of no quality if it doesn't have some, you know, poetic and structural relationship to the face. So, and it brings this African textile, of course, it brings up, I'm putting it here simply to emphasize this question of weaving, you know, because this, the emphasis he places on weaving and on dress, and the very word cladding in architecture, for example, also is connected to the German word Bekleidung, which is also dress in a way, cladding. And Semper will, when he arrives, he's part of this kind of coterie that are the brains behind the Crystal Palace. That is to say, the brains behind the Great Exhibition, and the aim of the Great Exhibition. They're not really the brains behind the building itself, because that is, of course, Joseph Paxton. But I mean, the interesting thing about the Crystal Palace, which is also a kind of woven building in a way, is it's extremely dematerialized. And I only recently rediscovered this image, which is actually in a book that I was involved in, published by Futagawa. I'd forgotten this image completely. I didn't actually find the image in the first place in any case, but I've never seen this image elsewhere very often, which shows the palace, this totally dematerialized cage full of people but no objects. And one of the objects in the palace was this Caribbean hut, which Semper claims, that this was an inspiration for him in formulating his idea of the 4 elements of architecture, which was in 1852, virtually the same time as the palace. And we see that, this thing point? Yes. We see, of course, well, first of all, it divides in a way into 2 elements, which is the roof work on the one hand and the earthwork on the other, raising the house out of the ground. And then the roof work is seen as one with the framework supporting the roof. So that's one element. And the second element, as I already said, is the earthwork. And the third element is the fireplace and the fire. That I think is one of the most extraordinary things about it. And of course gives it this sort of anthropological authority in a way. And the final element is the infill wall, which is the woven wall. Right? And he then associates different crafts with the different elements, so that the framework and roof is, of course, the craft of carpentry. The earthwork is the craft of masonry in a way, or something equivalent to that, piling up compressive blocks, or making a frame in this case and packing it with earth. And the fire then is associated with ceramics and with metal smithing and so on, jewelry, etc. And then of course we come back to weaving in the case of the wall, and the importance he attaches to the knot, actually, because which he sees as the primordial joint, and so this brings me to a sort of slight hiatus, actually, which ends me up in the Palladian Teatro Olimpico, shown here. And now I am going to read a bit of something. Okay. Semper conceived of the mask as a poetic fiction with which to overcome through ritual the harsh reality of human existence and the finality of death. In this way, both mask and clothing and the primordial hut are equally each dedicated to the creation and representation of an artificial microcosmos in order to establish human culture before the always threatening chaos of nature. This conjunction brings us to the origin and development of the theatre, and to its use of costumes and scenery and even masks to represent a relatively short-lived illusory microcosmos. In terms of Occidental cultural history, we cannot separate the stage from the invention of perspective as rationalized sight from the middle of the 15th century onwards. And this takes us immediately to Andrea Palladio's Teatro Olimpico, constructed in Vicenza in 1584. and to other perspectival stage sets of the period, which I'll show you in a minute. And of course, the big issue here is the fact that this is the illusory built constructive perspective. This is the fourth stage, the only part in which the actors can actually act, you know, because obviously on the sloping floor of the perspectival stage they cannot. And here, you know, you see the channels of this constructed perspective, which of course, you know, you can see how that construction allows, you know, figures in different parts of the auditorium to have the same, more or less the same illusion. And here we see it in reality. And here, and of course we do see, of course, you know, a Renaissance facade, an architectural facade. And here is a transverse section of the same thing. And this is the one other one, which is in Sabbionetta, constructed for the Duke of Mantua, a much smaller theatre, and but also, well, with the facade, or anyway, the kind of columnated amphitheatre, you know, equally architectural in a way as the facade. This is the plan of that stage, you know. And here, this, again, constructed, it's much rougher, of course, in the delineation, the representation of the thing is much rougher in these drawings than in the one that I showed you, in the one in Vicenza, Teatro Olimpico. This rapport between facade architecture and the stage comes into its own in the Renaissance, at that moment when the low-relief facade expresses a flattened depth. One recalls at this conjunction the distinguished Italian architect intellectual Giulio Carlo Argan, who in his book, The Renaissance City, argued that the Renaissance city as such never existed, and that what existed instead was the time-honored labyrinth of the medieval city into which set pieces were inserted, you know, by princes, mercantile or feudal princes, and you know, which were, you know, recreations of triumphant battles that were associated with the myth of their power, or, you know, they were equestrian ballets, or actually, of course, tournaments, medieval tournaments taking place, and sometimes they were set against, you know, temporary facades and quasi-theatrical settings, and other times they were. This is the Palazzo Pitti, with a roof over the top in order to protect the audience and also the action from the rain, and this whole thing is a kind of recreation of some kind of horrific battle, you know, as an entertainment with the audience, of course, piled up in the periphery of the palace itself. And you know, the ultimate kind of Renaissance facade, the most refined Renaissance facade, is surely, you know, the San Lorenzo, Michelangelo's San Lorenzo library, this being the kind of entry, and then this being I mean, what is extraordinary is the rhythmic low relief, you know, that yes, creates a kind of concatenation of classical motifs, you know, held into, you know, work of art in itself, in fact, you know, almost musical, you could say. And this, the library, of course, and this, the staircase feeding up into the library. And all of it being the same syntax, basically, variations of the same syntax. Anyway, the earliest use of the word facade in the English language, referring to the representational front of a building, occurs in 1657. This date virtually coincides with Inigo Jones's introduction of Renaissance architecture into Britain. And this is actually Inigo Jones's banqueting hall in Whitehall, where, you know, it's like a straight, yes, it's a straight transposition of an Italian Renaissance facade to British scene. Which takes us back, in a way, to Palladio and to this Villa Foscari or Villa Malcontenta that was, you know, it's one of Palladio's masterpieces, and where, you know, vis-a-vis facade and front, I mean, this is clearly an honorific front, you know, with, you know, this sort of deluded idea that it's a kind of recreation of a Roman house, you know, with monumental staircases going up on both sides, a building, the substance of which, the prism, is made out of brick. Of course, the temple portico is made out of stone, but the body of the building itself is made out of brick and plastered, and then, you know, the plasters worked, inscribed so as to simulate dressed stonework. But in fact, and also that is a sort of facade on top of the actual built fabric. And that would be, and all of, I think I've got these slightly out of order because that should, well, I've lost an image here. What the hell did I do with it? Vanished. Anyway, there's a back to this building, and somewhere, the issue I wanted to make is that in all of Palladio's villas in the Veneto, there is this decisive rhetorical front, facade as front, and a kind of very austere, much less rhetorical back, so that the style, of course, goes on, the putting on the style goes on at the front of the building in this point at which this is the Brenta Canal, and it's the honorific entrance from the Brenta Canal. And that would apply to all of his villas except this one, the Villa Caparola in Vicenza, which has, you know, talk about ostentation, but in fact is a yes, I mean, it has 4 temple fronts, in fact, on 4 facades consecutively. And so there is no back, really. It's just a series of endless fronts. You know. And you see it here in plan. And this is the transposition of exactly that idea in the 18th century, quite a while later, by Richard Boyle, otherwise known as Lord Burlington, to London. This is the Chiswick House, and the transposition of Palladianism somewhat after Inigo Jones into the British scene. So this, yes, finally, the back, right? This is the back of the Villa Foscari, the one that, you know, you enter from the canal. And it takes me, this whole question of facade and the theatrical aspect of the facade, and also going back to Semper's emphasis upon theatre, upon this poetic fiction, as he calls it, making a microcosmos out of the poetic fiction, to ultimately, you know, from Palladio's Teatro Olimpico and his whole obsession with perspective, to this building, which is the plan of Richard Wagner's opera house in Bayreuth, where, you know, his aim is the total work of art, a German term, Gesamtkunstwerk, where, you know, poetry, music, setting, costumes, would be synthesized to create this overwhelming total work of art that also was intended also to be life transforming as a program conceived in this book that he wrote called The Artwork of the Future. But the two interesting things about it are the orchestra pit, and I think maybe, and I'm not completely sure of this, that it's he who invents the idea of an orchestra pit, that you don't see the orchestra at all, you know. And the point being that his ethereal music should arise, so to speak, out of nowhere, out of the pit, and you know, and contribute to this phantasmagoric illusion of the opera that is then carried out on an enormous stage, where, of course, displacement in space can be easily achieved through literal displacement of space without constructive perspective. But where perspective is still floating around is here, you know, this very strange provision of these blades coming out with columns on the ends of them, you know. And because, and why? Because what he wanted to do is to kind of, he wanted to reduce the rupture of the proscenium arch and make the audience kind of think that this edge, that each of these edges are really the same edge, that somehow or other there is no final edge before you are thrust into this unworldly scene of the total work of art. And here you see it. This is what it looks like. You know, these blades are, you know, with their columns, their little classical pieces are inviting to this point. I don't have an exterior of the, stupidly, of the Bayreuth building, because that is actually the most utilitarian thing you ever set your eyes on. There is no temple front, no nothing. All the money and the energy goes into this, to create this interior, to complete his illusion, so to speak. And what you realize is that Wagner's total work of art is, you know, in the beginning of the 20th century, the cinema, film, will take over from Wagner's total work of art. The orchestra will disappear. The audience will forget the edges of the screen, you know. They will, you know, the moving image, and then, of course, sound gets to be added to it, will complete this kind of, will complete the Wagnerian project, really. And of course, what I'm showing here is a still from Lily Riefenstahl's The Triumphs of the Will, and I'm showing, in fact, this with this architecture in this Reichsparteigelände in Nuremberg, you know. This is, I think, circa 1936, you know. All of this is designed by Albert Speer, but it's designed as a, you know, with the idea of this mass. It's still even today, I mean, unbelievable sight, you know. The film is unbelievable. It's the film, The Triumph of the Will. It's really worth seeing because of its extreme rhetorical power, I think. And okay, now we come back to something quite different, because you know, the creation of the music drama, The Flying Dutchman is his first opera of a whole series of operas, coincides really, more or less, within a year or two, of Philip Webb's house for William Morris in Beckley Heath, Kent, which you see here. And here, you know, of course, it's totally and utterly anti-classical. It's anti-Renaissance. You know, there is no. The worst thing that could happen to this architect is for a facade to come into existence. You know, because all of these, you know, the free juxtaposition of the fenestration are obvious. You know, the different roofs coming to different heights. I mean, all of this in a way was inspired by Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin's Gothic revival, where, you know, the assembly, I mean, the idea was, of course, the English farmhouse, the random, additive, irregular assembly of the traditional English farmhouse. Here, of course, self-consciously created, where the windows are, like particularly this window, is by no means medieval. It's a kind of relatively modern sash window, you know, as opposed to anything medieval. Though there is a kind of medieval well head. Anyway, that's what Philip Webb created this for William Morris in 1859. And we see that the plan is this irregular plan and the beginning of the modern free plan. And in fact, the work of this period is called English freestyle. It's another term for it other than arts and crafts. And I mean, you enter here, you know, and this is the stair hall already. The stair hall is as a void in it going up through the whole extent of the building. This asymmetrically placed stair hall is also part of the whole story. And the plan, you know, is this L-shaped, somewhat irregular plan with bits sticking out, as though, and you see the stairs, there's a change of level here. It's as though the whole thing has been accrued over time, you know. It's an aggregation in a way, or it pretends to be an aggregation. And 10 years later, in 1869, Richard Norman Shaw creates this building called Leys Wood in Sussex for some extraordinary, yes, obviously extremely wealthy Victorian gentleman. And here, you know, you get, I suppose, things that might be facades, such as this, but you know, it's a totally irregular, random plan with chimneys all over the place. It's a picturesque composition to an extraordinary degree, and this is the other side, which is even more extraordinary and more romantic. These are drawings by Richard Norman Shaw himself, and the chimneys, of course, and the bay windows. All of this is you know, it's extremely brilliant in a way, you know. And I should have at this point, and I have to confess, another missing item, is maybe a shingle-style building or two, you know, that might make an appropriate transition to but I somehow forgot. To this, which is Frank Lloyd Wright in 1901. It's Frank Lloyd Wright, first Ladies' Home Journal house. And it also can be seen as, you know, the embryonic, liberative, dynamic, free plan, you know. And so that you enter here, you know, this is a door, this is a kind of foyer, really, rather elaborate foyer, and a stair hall. Within the central fireplace, but the most important aspect of all of this is this continuity between the library, the living room, and the dining room. And of course, there's an outrighting terrace that you can go out onto in summer. And behind, rather cramped, in fact, are the service facilities. And the architecture is reserved for multiple fronts, so that, you know, this symmetry here in relation to the library, or this symmetry and the hip roof in relation to the living, and again, the terrace in relation to the dining, you know, there's definitely an earthwork in all of this, for example, and a roof work going to Semper's categories. But when you get here, you know, you can see that this is just walls with pierced windows. I mean, he's no longer interested. It's no longer architecture at that point, you know. And the other thing about Wright's domestic work is it's not so easy to find the entrance. I suppose maybe you can get the message that this is the entrance, but in a way it's very unclear where the entrance is, and of course along with this goes which is also really against the facade, because this long roof and this roof, this whole obsession with horizontality and continuous casement windows, long windows in fact, create this situation in which there is no there's no facade, and the sheer emphasis on the horizon is against the frontality of the facade, though it's still using some classical elements, these sort of basins and of course these string courses. But we see, as in the first, this is 1909, it's 8 years after the Ladies' Home Journal House, and you do have this open plan, not so much maybe a free plan as an open plan around this central double-sided fireplace. You have it at two levels. One is the billiard room, children's playroom, and you enter at this level, but you see the way you enter is not so self-evident. It's kind of hidden in a way, and the staircase is here. The staircase is in the main. There's a servant stair and a primary stair, which is mixed up with the chimney. And then the main roof, of course, with its hipped form, emphasizes again the two primary spaces on the floor above, which are also open plan. But when we come to this part, although there's still a hipped roof on this part, you can see how the quality of the expression of the building somehow is reduced. It's not. This is where the garage is, of course. Here, there's a car court really, and the boiler room, laundry, garage, and then above kitchen and so on are service elements, and they're treated in that way. And well, this is just a beautiful shot of this house, which is still, masterpiece. But here, you feel, or it emphasizes the way in which you don't quite know how to get into this building. You have to kind of find the entrance. And that brings me to the other thing, which is that, relatively speaking, with his horizontal windows and his outriding terraces and hip roofs, Wright's buildings were open to nature and had, invited to kind of rapport with nature. It saw nature as as a benevolent context. But when it came to his public buildings, these public buildings, this is Unity Temple, of course, do have vestiges of a facade. Actually, there's a very strange texture on this image, which is ridiculous because it makes you think it's made of brick, but it isn't. It's made of in-situ concrete. And actually, it's for him a bad experience. I've been getting the quality of finish out of the concrete was something he found very difficult to do, and he generally put him off concrete for a long time. This is actually 1906, but the expressive representation of facade is in fact within. It's not without. This is true of all of Wright's public buildings, I think. And I've often wondered, why is this, It occurs again, of course, in the Unity Temple, where there is some representative features on the outside of the building, but it's largely blank, And that also then applies to, the contrast is also here. This is this internal atrium, and up here are inscriptions and capitals. The representative facade is really on the inside of the building and not the outside, and that will remain the case to the end of his life. So that the Guggenheim, there's some expressivity, of course. In fact, for some people, of course, too much expressivity, but in fact, it's still not. Well, first of all, it's still not a facade. It can't be a facade because of the plan shape, and the whole idea, but it's also somewhat empty. You know, there's no content really compared to, let's say, the Renaissance facade, and inside, of course, it it has this spiraling space up in the inside of it, and the richer kind of core experience is again within, rather than without. It's one little detail which might be of interest is that the image is based on a kind of spiraling pyramid. This is the word. He actually turns it here. I think he turns it around. This is the word ziggurat, and he turns it into Talguris on this drawing. You know that it's like a. It relates to his Gordon Strong automobile object in the middle of the Midwest as a sort of object to which he would drive for a Sunday afternoon. Which brings me to, of course, couldn't avoid him much longer, oh, that's the interior, right, there you are. So the richer interior is, even this, of course, is very simple, there's no ornament, but actually there is a sort of symbolic pool at the bottom of this, a kind of containing, representation of Louis Sullivan's seed germ. This, of course, it's totally and utterly removed from all of this, right? Also against facade. I could, and I ought to have, elaborated on this guy at greater length, which is Adolf Loos, the Steiner Villa of Adolf Loos, which this isn't the Steiner Villa, is, it's a degree zero of architecture. It's a cubic form, plastered over, it's white. And this building, which is in the same moment, is also a cubic form, plastered over white. And the richness is on the interior. You can't really call, it's not, of course, Loos's concept of the round plan or the space plan is certainly not a facade. But it's still, the more interesting part of the building is the volume, is the liberative, dynamic space inside. And I think modernity, going back to Wright's first moves towards an open plan, and involving also, of course, Le Corbusier's idea of the 5 elements of a new architecture, and also these 4 compositions. The 5 elements of a new architecture is 926, and the 4 compositions are 929. And and the fact that the space is the all-important thing. The exterior of the building is a kind of degree zero. The space, which is, of course, the 5 points are, of course, the free plan, the free facade, the long window, fenêtre en longueur, the pilotis, the columns underneath the house, and the roof garden are the 5 points. And the connection between this and classicism is very fascinating because at some point when they are first published, there are 6 points. And one of these points is the elimination of the cornice. And he gets rid of that point because he wants to, all right, there's no text that proves this, but I do know there are 6 points and then there are 5 points. And the one that's eliminated is the one that talks about eliminating the cornice. And it's my supposition that one of the reasons he does this is he wants to present the 5 points as though they are kind of technological, scientific, consequential, new architecture based on modern principles. Well, if you talk about eliminating cornices, you already reveal your dependency on the classical past, so I think he gets rid of it. But in these 4 compositions, he actually shows here, in this so-called, and I never know quite why, pyramidal composition, this figurative additive plan, very much like the Anglo-American or Anglo-Saxon free plan arts and crafts house. And then here he shows this second proposition, which is just a cubic proposition, and he just writes very difficult, satisfying to the spirit, you know. This one is very convenient, easy, picturesque movement. One can find, one can easily place, you know, clearly all the different functional parts according to a hierarchy. And then, of course, the free plan, pilotis, and the irregular, the fact that the load-bearing, the subdivision of the space is completely independent of the load-bearing aspect, because the load-bearing is carried by the columns, allows him to combine, you see, he puts these two together, composition cubique, pure prism. This, of course, is the Villa Savoie 1929. This is, I suppose, Villa Stein de Monzi, otherwise known as the Villa Garche of 1927. 27, 29. And here, this, you know, what you could say in a sense is this adjective, picturesque configuration is reinserted into the top of the prism, you know. And you know, he has a lot to say about this, you know, very generous, affirming in the interior an architectural will, satisfying to the intentions and all the functional needs, installation, etc., etc. So he, in the late 20s, posits this ultimate abstract modernity. In 1948, Rudolf Wittkower publishes a book, Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, which is an analysis of the work of Palladio. And in that same year, and I think scandal beyond scandal, even before the book itself is published, his prime pupil, Colin Rowe, publishes The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. I think he beats the old man to it, actually. And all of the argumentation of Colin Rowe is based on, it's derived from Wittkower, but it is anyway a stroke of extraordinary brilliance. And it changes then the entire view of Le Corbusier. And I think it is a fact that Le Corbusier acknowledges the validity of the argument. I guess there's no way for him to have refuted it. But the point being that it's the comparison between the Villa Malcontenta. By the way, this image, better than the one I previously showed you, shows only too clearly how this is brickwork, and the plaster is still here, but it's fallen off this part, you know, closer to the water, etc., you know, so that the poetic fiction of a building faced in stone is here, you know, wearing a bit thin, you know. And, but this is the issue, because this is, I'm sure you probably are familiar with it, but I'm probably going over old ground. But this is the plan of the Villa Foscari, Villa Malcontenta, the staircases and so on. And this is the plan of the Villa Stein de Monzi, which has this very, I mean, that most extraordinary of all is that its structural bay is 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And of course, it's the same structural bay in the Villa Malcontenta. In the other direction, with the free plan, these are cantilevers, so it's 0.5 of a module. And then there's something fallen off here, but it's 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. And here, 0.5 again. So there's cantilevers front and back, which of course are not present on the Palladian villa. And this facade, this brings me up, you know, I should have and I don't have. You know, I'm going back for a second. The garden facade of the entry facade here of the Villa Stein de Monzi is absolutely flat. There's only a large cantilevered wing-like form that comes out to indicate what is the main entrance. But the fact is that the smaller bays carry staircases. Even this smaller bay would have carried another staircase, but the staircase is displaced to one side, in order to allow it to function as a sort of major staircase as opposed to a service staircase. But anyway, the approach to the building is not, if you establish the idea of the front and the back in the Palladian sense, and the front is the temple portico, and the back is the flat, non-rhetorical face, then, and you enter through or ideally you enter through the front, from the canal, through the portico, the temple portico. Here, you're entering from the back, vis-a-vis this idea of front and back, and the front faces the garden, and this is the front. And on the front, the dynamic organization of the space inside means that, you're looking at an asymmetrical building, and also with enormous spatial displacement. The terrace is set back into the facade. These are these glass windows advanced. And this drawing is beautiful because it sort of combines the rhythm of the Palladian plan with the golden section, where he has to kind of contrive like mad to make the staircase have the same angle, so it would correspond to the diagonal of the golden section, And that is, you'd think it is the more rhetorical front, but it's the back. So the back and the front get to be inverted. And where am I going with this? Good question. All right. Well, I think yeah, okay. Let me, yes, another image would be helpful, I think. Yes, okay. So this is Bernard Hoseley, a very close colleague of Colin Rowe, who makes this drawing, which is a sort of, yes, it's an axonometric showing the planes that compose the garden facade. So this is the staircase, of course. This is these advanced windows. The terrace is going back into here, and these are additional planes in the space as you go back finally to the rear facade. And he likens that to the same layering of space in this Purist painting of Le Corbusier of 1920, a still life with a pile of plates, where the illusion, and that brings up the issue of Cubism. You see that it's clear that Cubism was categorically anti-perspectival, and that the idea was to flatten the picture plane as much as possible, and of course Purism, deliberately, categorically influenced by Cubism, and announced as a sort of alternative in good moment. Yes, it posits itself as an alternative to Cubism. Yes, because it's still this idea of flattened space, and what Hoseley does is to show that the illusory space of the Purist painting is similar to the actual spatial displacements inside the house. That's the whole point of these two diagrams. And the only other thing to be added to it is that, as opposed to Cubism, they were trying to represent, there is a representational function, the anonymous objects produced by industrial machine civilization. The industrial produced wine bottles and clay pipes and plates, and into which is woven a guitar, of course, that kind of almost obligatory Cubist icon. Which brings me to this, which is this comparison between two buildings. The Casa del Fascio in Como by Giuseppe Tirani, and the Gothenburg Law Courts by Gunnar Asplund. And I've used this comparison on many occasions, and in fact, this comes from this book, Genealogy of Modern Architecture, and where I tried to put together the results of a course that I gave for a long period of time on comparative critical analysis, in which I asked students to compare different types of buildings answering more or less the same program, or institutionally comparable programs. In this case, of course, what is in a way the equivalent of a municipal administration under fascism, the Casa del Fascio, and in the Swedish case, an extension to law courts, both kind of institutional public buildings, and in this case, both involving facades. And both involving asymmetrical facades, which I think relates to the asymmetry of their plan formation. In other words, they both embody a kind of dynamic liberative space inside them, and this dynamic liberative space, ostensibly functional, is what is the driving force of their asymmetrical character. And you can see that in the case of the Casa del Fascio, what am I doing here? Yes. No, that's the wrong thing. Back. I was looking for that. Do I have that still? Yes, I do. You can see this three-bay entry, for example, corresponds to a courtyard inside the building, an atrium, this corresponds to a terrace on the roof, which is also virtually void on top of the atrium, so that the presence of this atrium inside the building is indicated on the facade and is part of the asymmetry of the facade. And here, the asymmetry arises in large part, of course, out of the fact that this is an addition to an existing neoclassical building. This is the addition. And inside this addition, there is also a kind of atrium space, which is indicated by these four panels and also by these low relief sculptural elements on top of these panels, these window panels with doors. The doors open inwards so that they form kind of little inset balcony. And of course, in this case, there's a masonry base, and it's actually steel frame, fireproof steel frame construction, and there's even a detail of the molding here and at the top, which sort of echoes classical attic base and capital. And here also, of course, we're using stone, dressed stone. And the two buildings relate to public space in an interesting way, because this one is related to the back of the cathedral in Como. Here, it's a kind of a sort of axial relationship. And here, this is the neoclassical building. This is a public square. You can see it here, for example. This is the public square. And there's a canal that goes by. And this is actually the Gustav Adolf Platz. So they're both situated, somewhat classically in relation to the urban fabric. And right. So, and when you compare the two plans, you can see that these four windows, which I spoke about before, are meant to represent this space behind them, this atrium space, top lit or partly top lit, paved in stone, and you pass through the old building, and you turn here through a revolving door, and there's another elevation here, which I suppose one really couldn't call a facade, which is much simplified in relation to the classical facades that surround it. And so you see that here, for example. These are the classical facades. And for a long time, Wilson tried to give the addition, its own kind of front equal to the classical front. There are many alternative schemes that go in that direction. And here, the facade is, I think one has to speak about the elevation, I mean, this, of course, is strictly speaking the facade, but then it's cut away at this point with dressed stone underneath, and there is a battery of electrically operated doors which permit the militia to come from the interior of the building and sort of rush out into the street. You enter just from here normally, and there's a control point here with a major staircase in this position. And you can see from this drawing, for example, that there is this strange kind of tension between the three bays of the atrium, although the atrium is in fact more than 3 bays wide at this point, But the 3 bays are designed to represent the atrium. This is actually an early projection of the atrium. And yes, so when you go up the big staircase here, and blue shows public. These plans have been coded so that the public space is shown blue, the semi-public is shown green, the private is shown yellow. The argument of distinguishing between private and semi-public and public is, the public space is a space like this space, for example, where a number of people gather together. They're in fact courtrooms in each case here. This is a small courtroom, and so that they are collective. They are public in the sense that they are collective. And the same applies in this building, because although you can sort of raise a question about the coding. The endless problems that I got into with students arguing over what is public and what is private, And when I look at this drawing, I don't think we got this right, because this space here is this space here. It's the main meeting room of the Casa de la Patria. This is this table, the same table. And this relief, Mussolini, all the rest of it, this is a facade. And then I think when I look at it from this distance, again, I think this should have been blue, because, yes, and what involved here, of course, is the idea of private, meaning exclusive, and the idea of private referring to a kind of existential condition, where you have like 2 people in an office, or, but here, again, the question is, with this number of people in this space, should this have really been considered also public, in the sense that public is sort of quasi-political space? Here, I think it works, it's consistent in the case of the Gothenburg Law Courts. Well, this is the facade I was talking about, the kind of degree 0 glass wall that is, in... Where am I here? I have to go back again. Where am I now? Yes, this is the degree 0 glass wall is here, which, right. And so now, in a way, I've kind of talked myself out of the facade altogether. Because this, and I think it brings up the issue that the kind of dynamic, liberative space that was the driving force of the modern movement and is still very much present, is one that is always in conflict with the idea of a facade, you know. And so it makes a modern facade a complex thing to achieve, I think. And so, vis-a-vis talking myself out of facades altogether, here I'm discussing, or this comparison is really comparing two different staircases and two different spaces, you know. So, of course, this staircase is entirely enclosed and is also made out of dressed stone with glass balustrade and so on, with a glass block fenestration, and is very kind of precise, and you can see that from the way that is, this thing, this thing, you know, way it's detailed, is bent glass. And this one uses wood, and the balustrading is in a certain kind of traditional inflection. The actual going of the staircase is extremely gentle. It has a particular relationship to the structure, which is also cantilevered, going to this upper level here. And so they are very different interiors and very different. The detailing is different, the space form is different, but they all have a kind of a certain dynamic space form. And one of the things which I have difficulty in showing because I don't have the exterior image, but here you see, this is the plan, the penultimate plan of the building. And here you see there's a staircase that brings you up to the penultimate floor. And there is one floor above, which is served only by this staircase. And then the space that was previously occupied by the stair is covered over with an office. But in fact, if you study the elevation, this is also still a glass block wall. So the glass block wall that signified the stair, in this case here, is the glass. You know, it's continued. But what's behind the glass? If you say, you know, well, the glass block wall represented the stair, the main stair, then at the top of the building, the glass block wall is continued for formal reasons, but the main stair, the relationship between the mask and the face, so to speak, is no longer the same. And the detailing, very, very contrasted at the level of detailing, is of course the detailing of this balustrade versus the main stair of the Casas of Fashion. And then, you know, facade for facade, the difference between this facade and this low relief above the wooden fenestration, you know, plaster, and also this two different kinds of plaster used to indicate the main structural frame and the infill. And here it's all faced in dressed stone. And there are also wooden windows. But it depends upon the rhythmic articulation of stone. I mean, here, of course, there's also glass block being used, but the material is very different. I mean, here you see that the steel frame is enclosed in this fashion at the lower level to give this kind of organic columnar support to the building. And that, it's fascinating that the original idea for this space, you know, was a kind of almost neoclassical idea of the space, you know, before it's developed further. And here, you know, the facade is combined with a photomontage. Well, photomontage of two things. Photomontage of these militia in the foreground, and I think the project was never carried out, but this was a project for pasting up party leaders onto the the stone face of the building. I mean, making a kind of graphic out of it. And you can see from this, you know, with this slogan, order, authority, justice, militia, the head of Mussolini. I mean, the iconography is all of a piece, including this extraordinary photograph where it's no longer a facade, it's an image, of course. And anyway, all of these are images, but, you know, this Olivetti typewriter, in fact, you know, is shown as floating on this glass plane where the cathedral is reflected in the glass top of the desk of the administration. The relationship between the church and the state, of course, in that case. And then the furniture follows through on that, you know, the values implicit in the wooden furniture of designed by Aspland, which also relates to tradition in a way, or the organic light fittings and this use of a glass as a water fountain, or the fact that the workers who built the building put their initials into this tapestry. It was embroidered. Their individual signatures were individual, yes, the letters of their name were embroidered into this tapestry. So the attitude, I mean, there are different political attitudes involved here. You know, the authoritarian fascist state on the one hand, and the social democratic Swedish state on the other. And here, of course, I'm making some connection between de Chirico's metaphysical painting and the way Turani would draw would project the Casa del Fascio when it was first put together. All right, so that's my little, oh no, I didn't quite finish. No, I didn't. Because, yes, Louis Kahn. All right. Yeah. This is the front. Here we are, we get into this problem of the front and the back. Because this is the hypothetical front of the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. And this rather beautiful shot, which I think is actually a shot I took myself. I can't believe it. Anyway, I mean, I don't think I can do this anymore. Meaning I don't think I can take photographs anymore. I'm not sure I can lecture anymore either. But this, in fact, you know, I received my obituary today, you know. My wife is going to love that. I mean, I think that I should sort of keep that under wraps. You know, I have a year to go, you know, that's it. It's over. Then, all right. Okay, well, this is the front, ostensibly the front. And I suppose it wouldn't rate by common standards, this would not be a facade. However, it is the front. It is a kind of facade, and it has this honorific grove of Yopon holly trees, and also they're put on top of gravel so that when you walk, actually these maybe you know it, but these galleries, corridors, open, have stone floor, of course, and there's an echo in the inside of the vault, so you hear your footsteps as you walk towards the center axis, where are the Yopon holly trees, shoulder height, and a kind of sandy gravel. So when you come off, the echo ceases, and then and also your own body, the gait of your body is thrown off, because you know you're working on gravel after having walked on very resonant stone paving, and you're thrown off, you know, and also the trees are. It's a slightly strange it's a very, yeah, it's a kind of, yeah, I think one could say it's a kind of mystical entry. And the thing is that, you know, this is the park. Well, I ought to say this was the park, because Renzo Piano has, as you probably know, made an addition. I don't have that plan. And because this is the honorific entrance to the building, this is the front in that sense, rhetorically speaking. But of course, it's the suburbs after all, and people drive to this building. Mostly they drive. And they enter here, you see, into this parking lot. The front is over here, you know. And this park, very beautiful in fact, this relationship between the front and the park, which in a sense has gone. It's gone because Renzo added to the building, and to all intents and purposes, the park no longer exists. And this, yeah, well, this shows you, you know, how you, what I just described, you're walking, and also the sound of the water. It's acoustically very special place. And of course, it involves travertine and also concrete shell. This space here. And, but you, by car you enter here into this black hole, you know, and you go up a staircase. You don't see it in the section. And you arrive at the same point as if you'd come from the park through the main entrance. As if you had come through this entrance. You know. And so you enter, a bit like Le Corbusier's Villa Stein de Monzy, you enter the back. I mean, if you come by automobile. And you don't enter through the honorific front, mostly. And this is the kind of contradiction of the building. You know, Kahn never drove a car. He hated automobiles, I think. I once, probably with good reason, and you know, I once spoke to a young student who came from Harvard to go to visit Lou Kahn, and he told me that Kahn said to him, "Take the train, don't come by the plane." And he said, "I never understood why did he tell me that? I can never understand." And I said, "I think I know why. You know, for Kahn, you could only enter Philadelphia, his beloved Philadelphia, through the Beaux-Arts Hall of 30th Street Station. You couldn't enter it from the airport because there was no point in which you ever entered it, you know. You just, that kind of, and I think he must have known when he designed Kimball that, you know, most of the people are going to come by car. He had to provide for this entrance by automobile and so on. And I think, what did I say here? I do have something. This is the last word, so to speak. I can't hardly read it because, as always, of course, I don't have my. Where is it? Do I have it? No, don't think so. I have everything else, but I just give up. I mean, I'll just read it. All right, we can still read it despite the fact that I'm disappearing next year. Oh, God. You know, Randy reminded me it's 20 years since I've been here. I think I'm not coming again somehow. Oh, dear God. All right. And unfortunately, of course, another slide missing is Renzo's extension, because he is actually an amazing piece. Anyway, okay, I'll read it. You know, he did, very clever, he did long span laminated wood beams instead of long span concrete vaults, or bent beams, as they are in the main body of the building. And anyway, let me read, okay. It is a bizarre irony that Renzo Piano's addition to Kimball, comprising a massive provision of subterranean parking at an even lower level, should enable the automotive visitor to confront the main facade of the original building from the parking for the first time. Because before they had to come, up the stairs from behind, but now they pop out. I mean, there's an enormous amount of parking provided, much more than before, and there's an elevator coming to the primary level, and the doors open, and the visitor sees the Lou's main honorific facade for the first time. Relatively speaking, if they had previously come by car to Kimball, And I wrote, this is the last, all of which was achieved, one might note, by the loss of the park, the one element which gave Kahn's pedestrian entry from the honorific entry from the landscape its ultimate meaning. Thanks. Yeah, of course.
Folks, it's getting a little late and it's warm in here, but Professor Frampton would be happy to entertain 2 or 3 questions, after which we will adjourn to the atrium where there is a wonderful buffet and reception waiting for you down there, where you can continue to meet with Professor Frampton if you wish. So any questions? And we must mic the questions because there are people in 402 upstairs that will not hear you if you don't speak into the microphone. So any questions? Can you turn this microphone on, please? Yeah. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
Too hot.
I think they're ready for that reception downstairs.
Okay. Yes, well.
Good.
Okay, wonderful.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Ken.